Sleepy Sheepy here. Today we're going to be looking at a level 125 strength build using the heavy Crescent Moon Axe. We'll be putting 60 points into Vigor, 33 into Endurance, 61 into Strength, and 15 into Dexterity. Those are really the only stats I recommend changing. The rest of them aren't really necessary for this build. As for the armor, we'll be running the Crucible Tree Helm, the Raptor's Black Feathers armor piece, which is going to give us a boost to our AR when we land jumping attacks, the Crucible Gauntlets, as well as the Crucible Greaves. As for our talismans, we'll have the Crimson Amber Medallion +2, the Bullgoat Talisman, the Claw Talisman, which will further boost our jumping attacks, and then Shard of Alexander, although I will be swapping that around sometimes to Ritual Sword Talisman, and then occasionally to something like the Crimson Seed, Clarifying Horn, Straw Horn Charm, or the Molted Necklace Charm. We'll be using 3 different Crescent Moon Axes. The first one that we're going to look at is going to have Flaming Strike, which is kind of a default one. The next one is going to have Stamp Uppercut, which I just feel like is a very fun Ash of War. And then the offhand one will have Royal Knight's Resolve. We'll also occasionally be switching the offhand to a shield and be going for some new tech, but we'll talk about that in the next section. As for our physic, we'll be running the Strength Knot Crystal tier since we are going to be dual wielding this weapon quite frequently, and then the Crimson Bubble tier just to restore HP when we're close to death. Over the past few days, we've seen some really exciting new tech come out. So the two that I'm going to be focusing on in this video are going to be the Hunch running, which involves changing your weapon immediately after crouching. So you'll press crouch and then swap weapons, and that allows you to run around at full speed while in crouch. And that gives you the advantage of being able to stop running for a second and then immediately go for a crouching attack, because you won't have to kind of run, stop and crouch, and then go for that attack animation. So it's a little bit faster and can sometimes be useful. The other piece of new tech that came out was the perfect block. So I'm not sure if this is exactly new. I think it's been around for a little while, but we've had much better insight into how it works and how to land it consistently. And I do want to shout out both Steelovsky, G9, as well as Seriously Casual. Those three have been really good at just kind of putting out information related to this. I'm not sure if they were the ones that initially found it, but they've definitely publicized it really well. So a big thanks to them, and it's going to change the way the game is played, I think, moving forward, at least at the meta. So for the perfect block, what you want to do is run at your opponent, and then right when they go for a swing, hold up your shield and stop running simultaneously. So you'll take your finger off circle and press L1. You can just do it for a second, but you just want to make sure you have your shield up. And that should allow you to run through the stagger animation and be able to attack immediately after. So it doesn't really guarantee you anything. It's not like a guaranteed backstab. It really depends on your opponent, but it is really exciting because it's a great way to cancel a stagger animation, and it's amazing because it can cancel sleep or madness animations. So that's going to be really strong. I didn't have any instances where I used it in that capacity in this video, but it's something to be aware of. That similarly, how you can like roll through blood loss buildup and the blood loss proc, you can now perfect block against a madness or sleep proc. So that's really important. I think we're going to see a lot of changes to playstyle at the highest level, and I think we also have seen kind of the ceiling raised for the skill level available within this game. So that's two really pieces of new tech that's exciting, and we'll be looking at those two a little bit today. I really had a lot of fun with the moveset for this particular build. The jumping attacks are going to be very, very strong. So we'll have the dual wield jumping attacks that are being buffed by Raptor's Black Feathers, as well as the Claw Talisman. We can switch over to the Ritual Sword Talisman, and that gives us a further buff. And then if we want to go even further, we can Royal Knight's Resolve, our offhand weapon. And that should one-shot most players if we do land that jumping attack. So this can be a nice way to turn a 3v1 into a 2v1 very early if you just land that jumping attack with all the buffs stacked. Obviously, you'll need full health, and if you're not at full health, it can be useful to switch talismans just to something like the Shard of Alexander, which is going to be nice for going for something like Flaming Strike. And then we also have access to this unique heavy attack that I really like. I feel like it combos fairly well as a roll catch with just the light attack, so you can kind of get the stun lock. If your opponent rolls into you, you'll oftentimes be able to just kind of catch them with that particular heavy attack. So I was definitely a fan of that. And then we also have access to some nice ravioli steps. I feel like the extra range that you get with the back step can be pretty useful, and you get a simultaneous attack that comes out afterwards. So we'll be going for that a little bit as well. And then we do have access to a crouch attack, which comes out in 2 separate parts. So that paired with the new kind of hunch running technology is, not a bad option. You do need to stop before you go for that crouch attack, because if you continuously run while in that crouch animation, then you will just go for a running attack. So that's the same animation as a running light attack with the dual wield moveset. So just something to be aware of there. You do need to stop before going for that crouch attack, otherwise it is a running attack. But that's all I really wanted to say about the moveset in particular. As always, if you wouldn't mind considering subscribing, I definitely appreciate it. But that's all I've got to say, so let's go ahead and jump into the invasions and duels. Alright, so jumping into our first invasion, we have a 3v1. I don't know that initially, so I fall down while going for some jumping attacks and realize that there are a couple more players in the world than I realized. So I immediately start talisman swapping and weapon swapping so that I'm kind of all set up for the burst damage that I'd like to take care of a phantom in a one-shot. And I'm able to do that with the ritual sword talisman as well as full health and just the dual wield moveset. And then here I go for what I assume is going to be a trade, but it also one-shots the player going for the incantation, and now it's just a one-on-one, so I feel comfortable switching over to a shield and going for some perfect blocks. So this is going to be probably the best example of a perfect block, and we're going to look at that again real quick. You can see I put up my shield just as the swing connects, and then the player goes for another swing, which gives me the opportunity to get a backstab. A backstab isn't guaranteed. If they roll out, then you won't be getting that backstab often, but if they go for another swing or something, you'll be in a great spot to essentially like get a poise backstab, but against weapons that you normally wouldn't be able to get a poise backstab. Like a one-handed curved greatsword is going to poise break everybody. I'm running 69 poise, so that's not even really a factor, so we can just see how useful it is in that moment there. Next up we have a 3v1, and this is one where I'm trying to be patient and just get a feel for what my opponents are going for. So I'm not really being too aggressive. I'm just kind of hanging around, seeing when I might have an opportunity for another jumping attack. And here I go for a jump attack and switch opponents at the last moment there, just because I assume that the one phantom going for Rivers of Blood is the assumed target from the other phantom. So when I go for the jumping attack on the second phantom, then they don't react and roll appropriately, and I'm able to get that hit. I also switch over to a charm that is going to allow for extra blood loss buildup, and that allows me to win out in this trade here, where I go for a couple different trades in the attack animation of Rivers of Blood and manage to just kind of win out because I didn't get blood loss procced. If I had gotten blood loss procced, I probably would have lost that trade and died. So that's just kind of a moment there where we can appreciate the utility of having a talisman swap where we negate some of the blood loss buildup and, win out on trades like that. So had I been a little bit more prudent, I think switching that talisman back off to something like the Shard of Alexander probably would have been the play in this moment, but it didn't really matter too much. I was going for a fairly predictable opponent. They are very set up to land jumping attacks, which does put them in a spot where, I can grab some backstabs especially if they run on stamina. And here I think that's what happened. They go for too many jump attacks in a row, run out of stamina, and then I'm able to get the Flaming Strike wake up and just kind of finish off that 3v1. So this next invasion is another 3v1, and this one was definitely difficult. It started out as a 3v1, but quickly turned into a 2v1 after we do get one of those jumping attacks that just kind of one-shots a player. And I'll typically go for the player that looks like a wizard, just because that is often an indication of lower vigor. It's not always correct, but frequently they won't be optimized to, take a bunch of really high damage hits. So if you can get rid of a player like that early on, it can be really useful, and you'll also be in a great spot just to avoid, magic spam throughout the course of the rest of the invasion. So things definitely slowed down a little bit here. I was trying to deal with the potential blood loss that's coming from the Fly's incantation, and I definitely need to be aware of kind of the different players setup. The Great Shield on the Phantom is going to be something to worry about. My build isn't really optimized to deal with Great Shield super effectively. I'm not sure if I went for any kicks throughout this invasion, but that's definitely a good way to go. I'm also knowing that my jumping attacks are going to do a lot of stamina damage, so even if I don't guard break my opponent immediately, I think a couple jumping attacks will probably do the trick. So there we're able to land just a jumping attack and get the guard break. And then here I go for the wake up with Flaming Strike and really need to kind of get out of there and regroup. If I stayed there any longer, I think I would be dead at that point. and I am trying to just avoid those incoming flies and, incantation damage as well. So I take a minute to kind of just run away and figure out a different strategy. I would like to get rid of the different buildups that I have going on, so that requires a little bit of extra space and going into my menu. So running off here inside the building and having some walls as cover is going to be useful. So here I switched talismans just so that I'm less likely to get blood loss buildup, and that's definitely a useful option if it's in the mix. And then here I'm able to get rid of the just kind of extra blood loss that I've acquired just with a bolus. So taking advantage of players that aren't super aggressive can be really nice. I also switch over to a thrusting sword, and I've started playing a little bit more away from the build in some instances. So definitely during invasions that I intended for this showcase, I would switch over to a thrusting sword with Bloodhound Step, which can be just really nice in terms of getting out of really damaging situations. I tried not to use it too much and really just let the Crescent Axe be kind of the main focus of this showcase, but it is really nice to have that, especially if you're playing against players that are light rolling. Having a thrusting sword on hand is super important. And here I'd just like to note kind of the back-to-back backstabs followed up by stamp uppercuts. It was kind of one of those moments where I didn't really need to go for that, but I just thought it would be fun to see if it would work, and it did. So just kind of a use of the hyper armor that comes with the first part of stamp uppercut and a way to chip my opponents. And then you'll also note that on this build I do have a Cestus as well, and that's another good way to counter light roll if you have an aggressive player, just because your ability to stun lock very quickly is going to be useful. So those two things I think you'll be seeing more often from me moving forward, especially as I invade more at meta, where having those two just kind of available when the situation calls for it is going to be pretty important in terms of staying alive. So here I go for another stamp uppercut and just kind of use that hyper armor to win out on a trade there with my opponent, and my madness meter is also getting pretty high, so that's something I do need to be aware of. Definitely getting madness proc in a situation with two players that have potential for a lot of damage, especially with my lower health, is a little bit scary. So I maybe play a little bit risky here and don't deal with the madness buildup. Eventually I do back off though and use a bolus, and you can see just the clarifying horn charm is useful there, just because I took less madness buildup and I was less likely to get madness procced than normal. So super useful talisman swap, and then you can see me switching over to the Crimson Seed just so that I'd get a little bit more HP from the use of my flask. And eventually we do get kind of a misplay by the Phantom where they go for a pot throw, which kind of keeps them in an animation long enough where I'm able to get a jumping attack and just do quite a bit of damage. So that was enough to kill the Phantom, and then finally I get a jumping attack on the host. So I feel like that was just a nice example of an invasion where not everything went perfectly, but I think I made a lot of the right calls in terms of talisman swaps and just kind of being aware of the different status effects at play and picking my moments and essentially being able to win out on the just kind of long drawn out invasion. And I think that's going to be really helpful to be able to be comfortable in your menu and make adjustments as needed to the different play styles that you're going to encounter. This next invasion was another 3v1 where we have a couple different players, and I first run in and don't really do anything just because I want to see how they're going to play. So I feel like that's super important at meta level where there are lots of different ways that people can one-shot you. So getting to know the way that your opponents are going to play pretty early on, and then just playing defensively or passively throughout that initial kind of discovery phase of the invasion can be really useful. And then PvE got involved, and I was able to grab a jumping attack on one of the players and just turn it into a 2v1. So I mentioned this at the beginning, and I'll probably mention it again throughout, but really the strategy here is utilize all the buff stacking to turn 3v1s into 2v1s and make invasions a little bit more manageable with this build, because the moveset for the Great Axe is not bad, but not amazing without jumping attacks. So it can be very difficult to negotiate all the different incoming, magic spams and just attack styles that can come with 3v1s with a weapon that is not great for chase downs and has limited burst damage if you avoid the jumping attack. So eventually it does turn it into a one-on-one. I go ahead and swap talismans again just to avoid the blood loss buildup of Rivers of Blood, and then eventually go for that combo that I talked about in the beginning where we have the light attack followed up with a heavy, and my opponent was fat rolling, so that was a great way to get the fat roll catch. This next invasion is not super notable just in terms of like skill or anything. We have some just kind of stage hazards from the PvE cat, and I'm mostly trying to avoid that damage coming in, and eventually it does kind of help me out here and one-shots one of the phantoms. But here we're gonna take a look at something that I'm going to call the imperfect block. I'm not sure if this is something people are aware of or not, but this was a perfect block attempt that worked in some ways but failed in others. So you could see there that I did take damage in the process rather than stamina damage, which is what happens when you do get a perfect block. But I didn't get poise broken, and I should have gotten poise broken by the amount of poise that I have and the type of attack that I was dealing with. So we'll take a look at that again during the dueling sequence, but that's something that I've noticed has happened a couple times where I'll take damage even though I'm holding up a shield, or at least trying to, and then in moments I'll still be able to get the backstab. So that's something I'd love to hear more about from the community. If you're aware of this kind of imperfect block where you still take damage even though you've got 100% physical defense from the shield you're trying to hold up, but you don't get staggered, that would be something I'd love to hear more about if people are aware of it and if, you know, there's a name for it. So this next invasion was not super notable. I was able to one-shot 2 phantoms at once and then get a chase down on the host. So we'll just kind of gloss over that and jump into the next one where we do have 2 players. I'm able to go for a jumping attack on them, hoping to surprise them, but do manage to miss. So being aware that the aim with the jumping attack, especially at bigger heights, can be a little bit difficult, and the tracking isn't amazing on, you know, turns during the jumping attack animation. So unlocking in some cases is going to be a better play than trying to, you know, change your angle and jump and land that attack. But I do get a nice free throw with one of the frost pots on the phantom, and then eventually just grab a quick attack on the host and finish that one off. This next invasion is a 2v2, which was kind of a nice change of pace, where we had some gankers in Limgrave going for some somewhat sweaty setups, I would say, where you've got a player with dual Vikes, and then I'm not 100% sure, I think it's a Zweihander that the other player has, but definitely running high poise. You can see the, you know, classic veteran set. And I'm definitely taking my time. I'm not in a huge rush, and by taking my time, I'm able to wait for a co-invader to come into the world, and that's gonna make things a lot easier dealing with, you know, madness, as well as a high damaging Zweihander can be pretty difficult on your own, but having a competent co-invader is something that I always appreciate. So I'm able to kind of chase down this player with dual Vikes, and they switch players. I don't think they're totally decided on who they want to go for. I think they wanted to land a couple quick attacks on the co-invader rather than me, but it allows me to go for a backstab as well as a jumping attack on the host. So I go for a couple different Flaming Strike wake-ups. I found that Flaming Strike was a fairly reliable wake-up, but I think if players are going to double roll, it's a little bit harder to catch them. So I do get another backstab and go for another Flaming Strike wake-up. They roll out of it and don't end up taking any damage. And then here we can see just the utility of switching over to something like a thrusting sword. So rather than trying to effectively chase down an opponent with something big and slow like the Crescent Axe, I'm able to just very quickly make an adjustment to something that'll be better for the chase down and grab that kill. Next up, we have a 2v1, and this is going to be an example where we have not too much difficulty landing our kills, but just kind of a nice moment where we avoid the damage from Cannon of Hyema, which could have been pretty brutal, and do land a jumping attack followed up by a light attack on the host. And then once they've dropped down, we do go for kind of a ridiculous jumping attack attempt. So we got pretty lucky with their spot and just the timing of our jump, but we're able to land that for a one-shot as we kind of fall down from that height. So I mostly just like that one because of the jump attack. It worked out pretty well. And next up we have a 3v1. So I definitely like to kind of bait my opponents into some early attacks with frost prots, and then it's also a great way to just ensure that they take a little bit more damage in the process. So here I'm able to jump over waves of gold, and that jump definitely made it seem like I might have an opportunity to go for a high damage attack, and it worked out in my favor where I was able to jump over waves of gold, turn that into a jumping attack, and kill the high vigor player with waves of gold. So definitely a nice way to approach it, kind of see what my opponents are doing the first time, and then make an adjustment to kind of turn that into an advantage for myself. So I don't realize this at the time, but the other Phantom is actually running very low vigor, I think under 1,000. So I do run in and try to get some quick attacks, and then here we can see just the initial part of Flaming Strike does most of their HP. I'm able to land a jumping light attack with the two-handed moveset and get very close to killing them. And then here I kind of just read their run in and attack attempt and stun lock them with Flaming Strike, and the follow-up is enough to kind of kill them. And then here I do switch over to a shield, and I'm hoping that I'll go for a perfect block attempt, but the straight sword I feel like is a little bit less easy to predict. I find slower weapons better for the perfect block just because you're able to read them a little bit better and time kind of the block movement within the context of the swing. So having that available is, I think, a good way to go, and you know, adjusting your perfect block expectations based on the player's weapon, I think, makes a good deal of sense when trying to utilize it more often. So this next invasion starts out pretty badly. We have a group of 3 and Moonveil, as well as the Vikespear, Ash of War, and some of the Black Blade. But we are able to get a quick turn and burn with a jumping attack and turn it into a 2v1. However, we're definitely not out of the woods. We're still contending with Moonveil and Black Blade, which together offer a lot of opportunities for your opponents to stunlock you, and you can definitely get stunlock chained, and it can just be a bit of an issue. I also mistimed my roll when it comes to Carrion Piercer, so that was not a great moment there, and I definitely need to retreat, kind of regroup. I do go for a quick turn and burn just with a crouch attack. It doesn't catch my opponent. The tracking is not amazing, so it probably would have been a better idea to unlock there and just kind of aim a little bit more predictably, but eventually we are able to get that jumping attack. We land a light attack on our opponent with Black Blade, and then the chase down sequence kind of begins here. So we go for some light attacks. It's not too scary at this point. The biggest threat was the combination of Moonveil and Black Blade, and then we also start going for some Hunch running crouch attacks. We don't manage to land those. I think with a faster weapon it might be a little bit better, or with a longer range weapon, something like, you know, dual lances, it would be more effective. But we don't really need to deal with that in this particular invasion. We kind of got out of that situation scot-free. So we do have another invasion here, and this was one of the sillier ones where we're in kind of a bad spot. You know, that player wasn't using Quick Step or Bloodhound Step, so they were running really slowly. So rather than kill them immediately, I decided to kind of vary my approach, just get rid of the rot buildup that I have and go over to safety where I assume that the other players are going to go, and wait for the Phantom to come for me, just because I feel like the host isn't too much of a challenge. So I was hoping to kind of turn this into something interesting. So we do see either Quick Step or Bloodhound Step from this host, or Phantom rather. I was hoping to knock them off with the Jar Cannon, and it didn't quite work out, but as soon as they arrive, I go for Stamp Uppercut, and that was a great way to just kind of poise through their early aggression and then land a nice trade there that allows me to get the last bit of their HP. So we also have another player, a blue, comes into the world, and they're also rolling. So utilizing Quick Step or Bloodhound Step in this area is pretty necessary. We can see just them rolling away from the PvE, and the rot and the incoming Jar Cannon is a little bit too much. And so I go ahead and kind of take my time here and switch over to my weapon with Bloodhound Step, and I'm able to run back to the host. So this was all pretty unnecessary. I just felt like this was kind of an interesting environment to play in, one that I had an advantage due to the Bloodhound Step, and it didn't really feel fair to just kind of kill the host immediately. We could kind of see, you know, how they react and how they coordinate. They didn't coordinate super well, so I think it worked out pretty well in my favor just with the lack of coordination, but you know, you never know how it's going to go, so I think it's worth it to kind of give your opponents an opportunity and make the invasion more interesting if you have the chance to. So eventually we do see a talisman swap just to allow for extra blood loss buildup, and then use of some boluses just to avoid incoming rivers of blood. bloodlust, and then we do get a nice moment here where we can hyper armor through their incoming attacks with the heavy attack, and that's going to be enough to finish off our opponent. So next up we are in the Radon boss fight kind of castle area. So maybe it's Radon's castle, I'm not sure what the name of the area is, but we have somebody using Reduvia's Bloodblade, and we get a quick jumping attack on the Phantom that was, you know, standing a little suspiciously off to the side. So again, we'll do a talisman swap here just to avoid blood loss, and I can't really overstate how useful it is to incorporate that into your playstyle, especially if you do have a good kind of swap around talisman. Just being able to really hard counter that is going to be useful. So here we do get Dragon's Bite, and I just thought that was kind of a fun trade where we go for our jumping attack, they go for their Dragon Bite. I wasn't anticipating that it was going to be a Dragon Bite. I thought it was just going to be the Rot Breath or something, but it definitely worked out in our favor and was just kind of an interesting moment of well-timed thing. So next up we have a 3v1, and this is kind of just what happens when nobody levels Vigor. So we have some opportunities for jumping attacks, some kind of lack of understanding of how long the spell casting is going to take, and just understanding that they're really opening themselves up for a jumping attack or just a trade that they're not going to win. And then we do get a final kill on another wizard. So 3 wizards in a group that don't level Vigor is definitely something I'm kind of surprised to see this late in the game's life cycle, but it works out all right. This next invasion is not going to be super interesting just from the playstyle, but it is going to be a good example of the Hunch running, and just a moment where I was able to utilize it to some effect here against this Rune-Arced host. So I am in kind of a good spot where I'm not taking too much pressure from anybody and can kind of just mess around with that. So here I am in the crunch running animation, and then do go for that staggered attack. So you can see I crouch, switch over to the weapon, so I'm now dual wielding, and then you can look at my stamina and just see that I stop running for a second and go for the crouch attack, and that staggered attack is just a little bit faster than I think my opponent was expecting. So that's going to take us into the duel portion. This first duel is going to be an example of the imperfect block that I mentioned earlier. So again, I don't know if this has a name, that's just what I'm calling it in kind of conjunction with the perfect block that's come out recently. But here we can see somebody with a heavy thrusting sword. They're going for a heavy attack here, and despite the fact that that does 133 poise damage, I don't get poise broken, and I'm able to grab a quick backstab. So I found that to be pretty useful, pretty interesting, just in the context of, you know, kind of incorporating perfect blocks and seeing what they can do. So it is kind of nice not to have the stamina loss. Obviously, you don't want to take damage, but that could involve players that, you know, will opt to run this opportunity at lower stamina because they won't get guard broken, and then, you know, just if they have a lot of health and are not worried about the trade, it could just change things a little bit. So I'll be curious to see, you know, how that works now that we have a lot of people going for perfect blocks. I imagine the imperfect block will be pretty common to see, and we'll just kind of see how that matters, if it's something that occurs consistently or not, and if it's actually useful in any capacity. So this next duel is going to be a 1v1, obviously, with a player with a lance. I think they understand that I'm going for perfect blocks, so they go for just a backstab on me, which is definitely something you should worry about with this moveset. It's got slow recovery frames. I go ahead and swap talismans so that I have a little bit more defense moving forward. You never know if an opponent is going to go for something like fan daggers, and it's nice to have a little bit of extra defense. And then I do manage to catch my opponent with just a flaming strike and the follow-up. So they probably had the jump on me at the beginning, but I was able to come out on top just with a well-timed Ash of War. So here again, we have the use of the imperfect block. We can see that I took some damage. I didn't take stamina damage, and I was able to get a strafe backstab against something that definitely should have poise broken me. So that was kind of interesting. This whole duel was I feel like it was kind of fun just because we both had great axes and we were both going for the one-handed moveset. So the timing of our attacks was, you know, fairly well known to both of us, and I think that was pretty clear throughout the course of this particular duel, where it, you know, a lot of well-timed rolls kind of extended the fight, and we have similar approaches to our play style. We're very close to landing our rolls, and we have a good kind of back and forth in terms of, you know, delaying our attacks or only going for one, being aggressive, and just kind of switching priority pretty well. And this player does a great job of dealing with the pressure of low health. They've been at pretty low HP for quite a while, and eventually we do get some, some more attempts. I go for another talisman swap here just to get a little bit of extra defense, and then they go for catch flame, and I'm just a little bit faster with my attacks. So they might have been better off with continuing the great axe attacks, but I was able to come out on top there. So next up we have another duel. You can see me switch my talisman early. That was something that I found to be fairly useful when going for the ritual sword talisman. Rather than start the duel with that equipped, to switch over to it just a little while into the duel would frequently result in players not immediately going for fan daggers and just negating that. So I feel like that's an approach. If you are going to be using the ritual sword talisman, maybe don't start the duel with it equipped and switch over to it once there's a little bit more action, a little bit more movement, and your opponents will really need to adjust to that kind of in real time, and they might not even notice that you've kind of changed things up. So that ended up being pretty helpful for just the jumping attack that I landed early, and then we have an opponent going for Carrion Piercer, and I back off at the right time and manage to land a free throw pot that is enough to get the last bit of HP. So I was pretty happy about that one. I think the player was pretty strong, and landing that jumping attack early on was pretty helpful, especially with the extra AR boost from the ritual sword talisman. So this next duel is going to be against a Moonlight Greatsword player, or rather somebody going for Malekith's Blade, and just a nice ravioli step into jumping attack. That really worked out well with the stagger timing, and I wasn't in any danger of taking the Ash of War damage, which was mostly due to the stun lock from that ravioli step. So that was just a nice example of ravioli steps and how it can be useful. I don't use them a ton, but I definitely enjoy when they do connect, and I don't ravioli step into an attack of my opponent, so I'm always happy to see that. So this next duel it started off pretty rough. We had a couple of well-timed attacks. We have the Ash of War from the Nagakiba, as well as just a quick follow-up attack that kind of caught me off guard, as well as some frost buildup, but I am able to land a jumping attack, which kind of puts us a little bit closer to even footing. And just my opponent's setup is fairly difficult to deal with because we have some very quick slashes from the Nagakiba and then some long range pokes from the halberd, but I am able to get a quick roll catch with Flaming Strike after landing a light attack there and come out on top. So that's, just a moment where you shouldn't kind of count yourself out. You definitely always have the opportunity to kind of turn things around and just kind of catch your opponent off guard. So next up, we do finally have that player with the Moonlight Greatsword, and this was kind of a nice back and forth, I thought, where I could have taken quite a bit of damage from their Ash of War, or their heavy attack rather, since the Ash of War is just a buff. But we do get a nice early stun lock here, and then do a pretty decent job of adjusting for their timing of the heavy attack and get a nice jumping attack, which does most of their HP, and the chase down kind of begins. So you can kind of see how bad this is as a chase down weapon. You can see why I might switch to a thrusting sword when I'm in the context of invasions, but for duels, unless it gets really sweaty, I'll usually just kind of stick to the weapons that I've got on hand, or just like swap over to a shield for perfect blocks or something like that. So next up, we have another player. This player's got dual straight swords, and I do kind of go for that later in the context of the duel talisman swap over to the ritual sword talisman, and that allows me to at least land one attack with full health and is going to be useful. And we didn't get fan daggered early, and I feel like this player probably would have used fan daggers had they noticed. So definitely recommend that if you're going to be using that particular approach. I do not have the opportunity to talisman swap, at least at this stage of the fight. I definitely should have, but it ended up not mattering too much. So just being able to switch back and forth between ritual sword and something else when you do take damage is pretty helpful. Next up, we have kind of a bleed setup player where we've got some of the fly attacks as well as the pest threads, and then we also are seeing some attacks with the Bloody Helus. And the Bloody Helus is definitely something to be kind of worried about if they go for some jumping attacks, especially if they unlock and kind of utilize the long frame animation of the hitbox to kind of sideswipe you. It can be pretty dangerous, but they make a bad decision and go for a Madness Incantation. I'm able to utilize some hyper armor for that jumping attack and just grab most of the damage. And then here I'm able to go for just 2 consecutive light attacks. And I think the second light attack can come out a little bit more quickly than opponents are anticipating, and oftentimes you'll be able to catch them with that second attack just because they're expecting it to be a little bit slower. So keeping that in mind can be useful. Going for both of those light attacks consecutively can be a great option. Next up we have a player with a heavy thrusting sword and an offhand straight sword. So that's not a setup that I see super often, but we're starting things off pretty well where we have them at half health and we're at about 3/4 to 4/5 of our health. So definitely a good spot to be in, and I know that if I do land a jumping attack, it will likely one-shot them, but I don't try to overuse that. So, and even just switching things up, you know, from a dual wheel jumping attack to a jumping light with the 2-handed moveset can be a good way to, you know, more frequently land your jumping attacks. If you just consistently go for the same jumping attack over and over again, you'll frequently just get read and oftentimes backstabbed. So, you know, keeping that in mind and not only going for the same attack is super important, even if you are optimized for a specific move. And it's also worth noting that, you know, your chest piece in this case is going to be one that really gives away your intent just because it's frequently used for jumping attacks. But we do get a backstab, and that ends the duel portion of the showcase. As always, if you made it this far, I just wanted to say thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support. And if you do have opinions about the use of slow-mo within the course of these regular videos, maybe just to highlight specific things, definitely let me know. That's something that I used in some of my more like tech-based videos, but I do find it can be helpful just to look at different aspects of, you know, a moment in an invasion or duel or something. So if you care, let me know. I definitely love to hear feedback on that. And as always, if you have any build recommendations that you'd like to see, definitely let me know about those as well. That's all I've got, and I hope you have a good one.